Happy New Year!
Happy New
Uh,
Year to you, Doru.
Andrew, it's good to have you here. And before I turn to you more seriously, it's good to be back in the chair, so to speak, to do another AIOCS conversation. We have some select viewers, few but smart and switched on, so it's always good to brush them and pamper them. Um, And yeah, it's a fascinating conversation I'm proposing this time round. It's our first for 2026. Um, Someone whom I consider a friend and a co-worker, although we never met in person. Uh,
We have actually the IOTA conference.
was it?
Very briefly. Very briefly, we met in Volos, yes. But anyway, it was a very
My
short.
brains. My
No problem.
my apologies, Andrew. My
That's
apologies.
okay.
So we did meet. Yeah, well. Anyway, um, that's me. A privilege indeed. So, Dr. Andrew Jackson, and let me show you a bit of his profile. Andrew is a scientist by formation and trade. This is his official profile at the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, where he actually worked for many years, and now he is a uh, an honorary research fellow, isn't it? And um, Andrew has a fascinating life and his academic trajectory from very uh, hard kind of technological research to very deep theology. And this is actually the topic for which I invited him to be part of this conversation, and the topic to which we'll be turning soon. And this is another profile. Of course, you'll find him in various other places with conferences and talks, invited talks. I found a range of um, links to various activities and his contributions. Once again, Andrew, welcome, and it's indeed a privilege to be able to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Um, the pretext of this conversation is actually the fact that Andrew published at Routledge a milestone work. You know? This is it. Let me make it bigger. So it's in the Routledge Science and Religion series, Maximus the Confessor and Evolutionary Biology, the Phylogenetic Logoi, or whatever we want to pronounce. If you are Greek, of course, you'll say logi. But let's call it logoi today so that people don't get confused. And like with many serious publishers, there's an there and the rest of it. So Maximus the Confessor and Evolutionary Biology, the Phylogenetic Logoi. And of course, the title, the subtitle are both challenging, inviting us to consider the profile of a Byzantine theologian, perhaps the most profound Byzantine theologians, and the world of science, of biology. How did you get to it? Tell us something, please, about yourself, Andrew.
Yeah. Okay. Well, starting at the very beginning, I was born in Manchester in England and always from a young age was very interested in biology and particularly insects. I was an avid insect collector when I was a teenager. And I wanted to study entomology, right? And but there wasn't such a narrow course. So in the end, I did zoology at Oxford and had the great privilege of being taught by Richard Dawkins, the infamous Richard Dawkins, who at the
Why
time was
infamous?
not a
Not for
militant
me.
atheist. Um, so that was a great privilege because he was a fantastic teacher, and he really inculcated in me a love of the theory of evolution. But also, I was brought up a Roman Catholic, and I was also interested in the interface between science and theology. Although, of course, at that age, very much simplified and secondary literature. And so I did a degree in zoology. And then I met my wife to be, and something switched. And instead of pursuing an academic career in entomology, I decided I need to settle down and earn some money. So that made me go into industrial research for my PhD. So I switched slightly from zoology into bioengineering. So I did a PhD on biomimetics, copying nature's design from seashells from a substance called mother of pearl or nacre, which is 3,000 times the toughness of pure calcium carbonate and yet has 95% volume fraction. So my industrial sponsor was interested to know why. So that led to a PhD in bioengineering, and then I went into industry, into medical research. So I worked for a big medical device company for 21 years. It's quite a long time, developing things like tissue engineering, cell-based therapies, artificial adhesives, and to mend skin and bone repair. And towards the end of that career, I started to get a bit fed up, thinking, why am I doing this? What I'm really interested in is theology. And whenever I'd go on business trips, instead of reading my business papers, I'd be reading some kind of textbook on philosophy or theology. So in the end, well, there's a short period first that I lost my job, and the only way of getting a new job was to come down to Cambridge, where there's lots of science jobs. So I worked in consultancy for 8 years, but even that then started to get difficult. I started to feel this is not what I really want to do. So my wife noticed an advert for a job at the Faraday Institute, which was a development director position, a fundraising position. And because I'd previously been doing business development for these consultancies, I thought, oh, I'll be ideally suited. So I spent 2 years at the Faraday in that capacity, but I was abysmally unsuccessful because there's a big difference between raising funds from Christian philanthropists and doing business development for industry. So that didn't really work out. So I started to think, well, actually, what I really want to do is to go back to university and study theology properly. Because I've heard so many of these invited speakers at Faraday, and all I can do is sit on the sidelines with my very amateurish theology to try to understand it. Why don't I do things properly? So my wife said, okay, I'll let you do that as long as you do all of the houseworks the chores in future, do all the cooking, washing, everything, because she was basically bankrolling me to do this because she still works at a DNA sequencing company. Um, so that's what I did. Because I live in Cambridge, I was able to do the bridging postgraduate diploma in theology at Cambridge, which was just for 1 year. So I avoided having to do the full 3 year undergraduate tripos, and that was the best thing in my life. I suddenly my life was revolutionized, even though it was slightly awkward sitting with 18-year-old undergrads in lectures and everything. I enjoyed every minute. After that, I did an MPhil master's at Cambridge as well. And that's when I first came across Maximus. So we had a module on famous Christian theologians, Augustine and Schleiermacher, all sorts of characters. And I was gobsmacked when I read Maximus because for the first time I'd read an Eastern church father. For the first time I'd read about a view of creation which was not the usual boring ex nihilo stuff. It was a lot more packed into Maximus than you get anywhere else. And of course, if you the other thing I should say is that I switched to Protestantism during my university days. My faith, my Catholic faith was kind of robbed from me. That's a different story. I won't go in there. But so I ended up mostly reading sort of reformers theology. And because the creation wasn't ever an issue in the Reformation, the reformers don't really tend to go into theology of creation very much. So reading Maximus, though, was an eye-opener because there was so much rich detail and speculation about creation. So that's when I decided I wanted to do a PhD on Maximus as well. Unfortunately, my supervisor at Cambridge, Andrew Davison, who's now in Oxford, he's a Thomas Aquinas scholar, and he really couldn't take me on. So I had to look elsewhere, and this was around about COVID, and I ended up going to Nottingham, distance learning PhD with Michael Burdett and Connor Cunningham. And even they weren't really Maximus scholars. In fact, my original application wasn't to do something to do with Maximus because I had to apply before I had understood that I wanted to work on Maximus. And so I was a bit naughty on them because I switched the project before I started. If it had been Cambridge, they would have gone back to the degree committee and said, "Oh, we can't do this, Andrew." But Nottingham said, "Oh, that's fine." So that meant that although Mike was a fantastic supervisor and so kind and helpful, he really wasn't a patristics expert, let alone Eastern Orthodox expert. So what I did was I reached out to Elizabeth Theokritoff here in Cambridge, and she very kindly put me in contact with a lot of Eastern scholars who helped me with my PhD on Maximus. So what was the if you're happy for me to continue, I mean, I can rabbit on. What
Please do,
what
please
made
do.
me want to work on Maximus was because in the secondary literature, I noticed a lot of very tantalizing allusions, comments to Maximus's logoi cosmology and evolution and DNA and genes. Five or six scholars had mentioned this, but only in passing, very, very briefly. So the aim of my PhD was really to bottom this out, to see to what extent these scholars were onto anything. Um, is there really some kind of correlation, any kind of synergy between Maximus's views about the logoi vested in creation and evolutionary change? Obviously, Maximus knew nothing of evolution, and there's great danger of reading into ancient authors modern things, but the connection seemed too strong to miss, and people far more famous and competent than I had already made the link. So that was basically the origin, the motivation for the work, to go into that in much more detail.
That's a wonderful, inspirational story, life story. Uh, yeah, seeking theology while coming from the foundations of science and technology. My own journey is a bit different. Well, very different actually. While I had always kind of eclectic interest in many things as a teenager, uh, life, providence, whatever, pushed me towards theology when I was already 16 or so. And yeah, with the theological high school in Romania, then undergrad and PhD. Um, but I maintained this interest um, in the world of science, popular science, in my case, and I worked all through my life towards bridging these worlds of theology and scientific research, scientific ways of representing reality, and so on and so forth. This is actually how I got into Maximus.
Right.
So, doing my um PhD research in Bucharest, the University of Bucharest, my supervisor initially wanted something as broad as um, logos and creation. And as a matter of fact, this is how my dissertation was passed, with the title Logos and Creation. And he didn't expect me to go this way or that way, but given my interest, started in the early 90s in Athanasius of Alexandria and then Maximus the Confessor, I realized that there's a lot of potential there, and I dedicated actually my most of my dissertation to studying Maximus's cosmology, which I did in conversation with the anthropic cosmological principle, which was still trendy at the time. So, I mean, the 80s, the grand age of the anthropic principle, and I started my PhD research in '95. So I was still fresh, and for the scale of post-communist Romania, it was still fresh, cutting edge, and misrepresented by many of my colleagues. So much so that I have been misrepresented by many of my colleagues, and I had to abandon ship to leave the country, actually. Yeah, so this is fascinating. We find this figure, Maximus, as someone who can speak to us today, and I'm amazed by your tour de force in the book. It's obviously testimony to your double expertise as a scientist, biologist, and a theologian. I'm certain that with the time passing and some solid engagement on the part of people who are interested actually in looking at Byzantine figure as significant for faith and science, or science and religion, your book will prove to be the crucial point for the development of this entire field. So Maximus, a man who lived so many centuries ago, so 6th century, 7th century, is still a good person to talk to, figuratively speaking, someone whose wisdom a 21st century theologian, scientist, or scientist theologian can engage with delight and with beautiful outcomes. And you did so. I invited you to have this conversation even before I had an opportunity to finish your book. But I'm excited by your approach, and I think that this is the way. And I'd like to return to a point you made a moment ago. We should be careful. Sorry, I'm paraphrasing here. We should be careful when we look at an ancient or medieval thinker like Maximus through the lens of, let's say, our knowledge or our culture. We live in the age of evolution. Regardless of what we think about science, even flat earthers manage to say from time to time over the globe. And things are in motion that cannot be undone, to go a bit Lord of the Rings. So we live, whether we like it or not, we live within a scientific paradigm dominated by the idea of evolution. And yeah, of course, this is a new development. But is it, Andrew? Reading at least partially your book and an article you published before in Zygon, yeah.
Yes.
The one you got a prize for. I realized
Yes.
that it wasn't only a matter of reading into Maximus, our own, say, culture, knowledge, ideas, whatever, views of things. It's also a matter of translating translating what Maximus did. And I think I had a similar revelation more recently. So I'm no longer working on Maximus. I intend to return. I haven't even published my dissertation. So I intend to return and rebuild that case. But I discovered similar stances in the Cappadocians, and then going backwards in time in earlier Alexandrians like Origen and Clement. Clement is my beloved figure at this time. And I have been criticized that I read evolution into. But I wonder, is it reading into or just translating in our terms something that we already see there? Of course, they didn't know what evolution means, and they didn't know anything about Darwin or your master Dawkins and so many others. But their intuition of reality was very close, very related to what we would call today, in broad terms, evolution. And I want to, if possible, for you to comment on this, but not before I give an example of a different sort. I remember finding years ago in an essay by Werner Heisenberg a reference to Heraclitus. And he said Heraclitus's world, Heraclitus's depiction of reality, is very familiar, or should be very familiar to us, because now with the quantum revolution and relativity and all that, everything is in motion. We have a better we are better positioned to understand what Heraclitus actually was saying. The world of Heraclitus has three, let's call them strata. At the center of all things, it's the logos. Yeah, so your logoi. It's, let's call it information. Then comes the fire, energy, quanta. Yeah, and then the external movement of let's say material things. And Heisenberg said, well, regardless of how poetic and metaphorical Heraclitus's language may seem to us or sound to us, what this guy had an intuition of was a world that is very much our own world. That's Heisenberg. Yeah. And I found similar references to, I think, Stoics or something. No, Pythagoras, in Michio Kaku, yeah, with superstrings and all that. So if these hard scientists, knowing their stuff, can look at certain stances of ancient thinkers and say, well, that's an intuition that goes way beyond its time, anticipates our own era. I'm certain that even for us who work in patristic studies one way or the other, perhaps it has now it's the time to find that same courage and say, well, I'm not reading evolution into Maximus. Evolution is how we refer to what he describes. What do you reckon? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think it's such a big deal, really. I think there are times when science and theology do come up against each other in a more conflictual way. For example, when historical theology might make claims about the age of the earth or something like that, you know. But for a lot of the time, especially my reading of Maximus, it's metaphysical claims that are being made, which are not in competition with the science anyway. So they're two different descriptions of reality. So that's why I don't think, maybe I apologize too much about reading into Maximus. I mean, there is an exegetical risk of that, but at a grander scale, I think what I was doing in my book was to make metaphysical interpretations of evolution through the lens of Maximus, and also using evolution, the vocabulary of things evolving to describe what Maximus was saying in terms of the logoi moving from being to well-being, eternal well-being, for example.
Yeah,
So I was engaged in a dialogue, a two-way interaction, but not one that is in direct competition.
yeah, yeah.
Now, there have been people who have tried to say that they are in competition. Like there's a guy I referred to in my book, Vincent Rossi, who I think was a student of Metropolitan Ware, Callistus Ware, who did try to say that Maximus and evolution are incompatible. But that even that is was based mainly on a metaphysical claim about types not changing,
Yeah.
the logoi defining types. And of course, Darwinism has shown that typological thinking has been replaced by population thinking. But anyway, I resolved that by reference to the fact that the logoi define particulars as well as types and genera and species. So I agree with you, yes. And I think also science engaged theology, since its inception in the 1950s with people like Ian Barber, has tended to be quite preoccupied with modern projects, the Divine Action Project and the mind body problem. And if there's been any theological reference point, they've tended to be relatively modern reference points. Karl Barth, or going back to Aquinas, the level of ressourcement, the level of recovery of theological information has been limited. And especially in the East, I think orthodoxy has a lot to give to debates about, say, theodicy, evolutionary theodicy, but it's very underrepresented. So I like Andrew Davison's um, encouragement for us to do more resourcement of ancient authors. Instead of doing science and theology on a subject in general, to make it more specific, to engage in Clement or Origen or someone else
Maximus.
and see what they have to say. And Maxim, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely, and this is a bias that, as a theologian, I faced many times over. Uh, Sometimes historical theologians would tell me that, it's illegitimate what you do. You read too much from your own convictions as a 21st century person into the views of, let's say, Clement in the 2nd century or Maximus in the 7th, and so on. And of course, what historical theologians would insist we must do is just read them in their own context, against the backdrop of their own culture, full stop. My usual response to this kind of criticism is that, let me be very orthodox. Bloody hell, this is what you did to the Bible. As an academic study, you transformed it into a source of historical information, more or less accurate, most times inaccurate, and you are happy with that kind of narrative, forgetting that there's millions of people who through the centuries looked at that literature from a very different angle, from a different viewpoint, as a source of inspiration, joy, wisdom, and so on and so forth, paying very little attention to the historicity of this or that narrative in the scriptures. But according to biblical scholars, it's illegitimate to read too much of our own experience and aspirations and expectations and so on and so forth back into the Bible. That's a very different universe, and we have no idea of that universe unless we read I don't know how many libraries of biblical scholarship. Well, I think now we realize that something similar happens, but this is a fairly recent development in patristic studies, where people who are actually historical theologians, to put it mildly, they are historicists from my viewpoint. Historicists, yeah. They want everyone to shut up and stop seeking the wisdom of one titan like Maximus, and just get to the minutiae of philology and I don't know, theological controversy and whatever historical backdrop can be gleaned in the process of studying such an ancient or medieval text. And I think that's the end of all things. The way they kill the Bible, this is how now they kill the fathers of the church, by transferring them to the realm of an archive, just cataloged and stored, never to be touched, or never to allow them to touch our lives. So what you do there in the book, Andrew, is amazing. You actually show that a 21st century scientist who is now also trained theologian can adopt a different lens, shift gears or whatever, turn the lenses upside down, and all of a sudden you are in Wonderland. You realize that it was all there, but we didn't know it was there, and now that we realize it's there, we are even afraid to call it for what it is. But I believe that once the public becomes more and more aware of your book, of your discourse, of your research, and this somehow is diluted for the popular levels, popular consumption, this will become a groundbreaking moment, because believers always thought, at least believers of some sort, of the intelligent kind, yeah, always thought that there's something divine to be grasped behind all this scientific narrative about everything. And now you have proved that under the guidance of Maximus, so to speak, you were able to achieve that, to get there, to Wonderland.
Well, it's very kind of you to say. I think the final kind of defense you could make is that even if what is interpreted about a church father like Maximus is not fully in keeping with what they would have intended, supposing there is a bit of eisegesis going on, I still think that you can think in terms of being neo-Maximian or neo-originist in letting the text float away from their original context. Maybe it was the monothelite controversy that Maximus was really mostly engaged with at the time, for example. But I don't think there's any problem in taking what he says and thinking, well, what would that mean if we transposed it into this modern setting? Because it can still be very informative and provocative, even if it's not what the original author fully intended. And I imagine, as I say in my book, if Maximus did know about evolution, like all his peers, he would have been against evolution because everybody thought that species were fixed. You know, it was just the Aristotelian view of the world. So I'm certainly not trying to claim that he was like a child of modern day evolution.
Well, yeah, but see, there are cracks in the wall, Andrew, uh, and I repeat, I haven't read seriously Maximus in years now, so I betrayed my the one whom I consider my spiritual father back in the day. Uh, And I remember reading something, I think it was in the responses to Thalassius, something that really stood up for me. He talking about the Logoi theory, and we'll return to it in a moment. He actually said that within the parameters of the Logoi, of these divine principles that whatever structure and guide reality, uh, the tropos, the mode of existence of things, experiences what he called um, diastolic and systolic movements, uh, dilations and contractions, shrinking and broadening. And he says, well, this is what happens at the level of the tropos. So each being within the created reality has at its core a logos, like in the Heraclitean universe. This is why I consider Maximus very Heraclitean from this viewpoint. So the core of all things, there's the logos. Then there's the energy, the fire that makes things move, go, whatever. And there's the outer shell, where everything takes place, so we can observe these inner movements. And Maximus says this outer shell of things, the shape of things, the tropos, the mode of existence, experiences successive dilations and contractions, shrinking and broadening. He doesn't insist on it, on this one. He doesn't describe what he means by it. He doesn't clarify. But I think that that's one of the most significant statements he makes in regard to, let's call it, the ontology of a created reality. Where on the one hand you have the conditioning, the internal conditioning of things by the logos. You have a natural movement in things. You have a divine kind of permeation of all things. And then at the outskirts, in the phenomenal realm, you see change, real change, with dilations and contractions, systolic and diastolic moments. Well, from my viewpoint, again, I might be biased as an evolutionist heretic, as my Romanian friends call me. What I see here is precisely what you would say today to a popular audience when you want to present evolution. Yeah,
Yes.
there are changes, and Maximus captures this possibility, which for him is universal. It has to do with everything that happens in the created nature, yeah, with everything being in motion, and experiencing diastolic and systolic movements, contractions and dilations, morphological change. For me, this is the exact opposite of let's say, 7-day creationist Maximus. But that's me. Let's return to your book, though. Could you please offer a summary for this reader who is still
Yeah.
a long way to finishing the book, but also to the viewer?
Sure. Okay. Well, I divide the book into roughly two parts. Those elements of Maximus's Logoi cosmology which seem to be resonant with evolution, and those which are more dissonant. And I start off also by explaining what the Logoi are, the rich philosophical heritage that they come from. Obviously, there's the biblical rooting in John chapter 1. There's the Stoic overarching principle in the universe. Maximus's Christianizing of the Logos. And basically, the way to view it is that the Logoi are like refractions from, you imagine white light going through a prism, the white light being the Logos, and they get refracted into creation. And there are a number of very interesting aspects of this in Maximus. So the first thing is that the logoi seem to define all things, everything, from the smallest to the biggest. And they do so in an immanent way, an internal way. They're not just external descriptions, as we might do as scientists, labeling, classifying things. They constitute things. And not just like Augustine would say, like God's omnipresence is like water filling the pores in a sponge. No, no, no. They're not just filling the surroundings of things, they are actually innermost, constituting all things. A bit like the information content, or to use Aristotelian causation terminology, they are like the formal cause, but not just the formal cause, they also define the purposes and the trajectories of all things. Um, as opposed to a view that is simply that God is the efficient cause,
Mm.
the source of power and will, right? Which you do find, I turn to this a number of times in the book, contrast Maximus's view of creation with other more voluntaristic views of creation, which God's will is emphasized, arguably too much. And that's one of the dangers of stressing creatio ex nihilo too much. I mean, Maximus clearly supports ex nihilo, but he doesn't take it to the extent that some Protestant scholars say, where it's almost like it's a um, creation is a result of pure will, and God doesn't even know what he's going to create because it has no relationship to God. There's a chasm between creation and God. Um, so ex nihilo is important to safeguard God's freedom, and it's also important to ensure that God is not a material cause budding off his own self into creation. But creation is also ex theo, ex deo, because all of the principles of creation come from God's mind, if you like. And they also, they're all, if you imagine a human artisan taking inspiration from the natural world to paint a picture or sculpture, God has nowhere else to take his inspiration from except from himself, because there's nothing pre-existing God. There's nothing alongside God. So all of creation participates, resembles his own excellencies and nobilities that he has in himself to start with. So that's why um, creation is, the logoi are constitutively immanent. They are forming the information of the whole world. But that's a rather static view of the world. And as you say, Doru, there's a huge dynamism too. And I noticed with Maximus, there's three elements of motion. There's first of all the Neoplatonic notion of procession and return. All things are moving towards an end. There's also superimposing on that is diastole and systole, expansion, contraction. And then the third kind of motion that Maximus talks about is moving from being, which is effectively like predetermined ideas or wills in God, eternally with God, to well-being, which is when things are instantiated in finite creation and they flourish and they move towards their natural flourishing. And then finally, eternal well-being, which is deification, when things reach their culmination and their perfection.
Or at
And
least
this is
their state
nicely
of
illustrated.
yeah, sorry. At least their state of actuality, to put it in Aristotelian terms, the realization
Yes,
of the entire potential.
that's right. Yes. And in my book, I have a few diagrams because Maximus himself uses the picture of a starburst or a wheel with spokes radiating out, and he takes that from Dionysius and Plotinus. So the logos is like the center point, and the logoi are radiating out. And as they as they radiate out, they become more differentiated, and as they contract back, they become closer and closer to each other and to the one. If you superimpose on that starburst diagram and a hierarchical splitting as you get with expansion and contraction, it resembles, eerily, spookily resembles a modern day depiction of the tree of life. So, the Darwinian tree of life used to be drawn like Darwin did himself in The Origin of Species as a bush or a tree. But nowadays, to avoid the implications of bias towards any one species, because there is no single trajectory of evolution, it's a copiously branching bush. Biologists tend to draw it as a circular diagram where every point on the circumference is a different species. And that's just what Maximus's vision then looks like if you superimpose his expansion and contraction on his starburst diagram. So you had this dynamism happening as well as this constitutive immanence. And by the way, that expansion contraction, by the way, I interpret that not as tropoi, but as the logos expanding and contracting. But we could talk about that. That's a
Oh, no,
matter
no,
of detail.
I hear you,
Um,
and I agree with you, and I think I even read that part of your book. Um, this is why I mentioned there's in one instance, I don't remember where I found it, but in one instance, in responses to Thalassius, I think this is where he actually refers to the tropos of things. This is why I mentioned that
okay.
particular case as
Right. Well,
something
we
that,
can come back to Tropos. Yeah, Tropos is a very interesting, more controversial area. Um, but what I was going to say was that the expansion contraction goes from the most generic genus down to the most specific species, down to particulars. So Maximus, in various places, talks about the logos of particulars. And furthermore, in case you think that there's a kind of compromising of God's divine simplicity, Maximus strangely says that every single logoi or logos with a lowercase l is itself the logos with a capital L. So every single component of this complex hierarchy is itself the logos. So that means that God is somehow present as the second person of the Trinity in all things, not just in the ground principles, the big types or the transcendentals of beauty, goodness, truth, etc. But he's in every single particular. And that is really, really important. And it comes out in my applications section, the last chapter of the book, when I talk about the importance of particulars to dignify all creation, because as we now know, evolution is a haphazard process in which there have been lots of cul-de-sacs, lots of dead ends, and lots of intermediates that never made it, um, lots of apparent wastefulness. But if you take Maximus seriously, every single particular, every single accidental mutation is entirely imbued by the Logos.
yeah,
Now, that to some people is a very controversial thing to say because a lot of theologians don't like the apparent wastefulness and lack of direction in evolution, and they rather take more of a somewhat process theology view that God is orchestrating the general principles, is putting the boundaries in, but within those boundaries, creation has freedom, and that lets God off the hook for various bad things that happen in evolution. So God gets what he wants generally, but the details is God's not micromanaging. Whereas my reading of Maximus is the exact opposite, that God is innermost of all things, working out things from the inside. And this is not a new view, by the way. So the early 20th century Lux Mundi group of Anglican, High Church Anglican theologians like Aubrey Moore and J.R. Illingworth, they were supporters of Darwinism, and they thought that Darwin actually did us a service because it took away this overly mechanistic, distant view of God orchestrating things from afar, like Newtonianism gave us, where creatures are passive objects being orchestrated by God, replaced it with an immanentist view of God working out all things from within.
Mm. Yeah,
And
and
the
yeah,
way to
again,
describe it,
sorry to interrupt you, but I think Maximus returns a few times. I think I remember him doing so to the famous phrase in First Corinthians 15, "God will be all in all." He has this sense of a dignity of creation, as you call it, and I think you already called it so in your Zygon article, isn't it? You spoke of this dignity bestowed by the Logos through its own presence in the tiniest parts of reality. Yeah, God all in all. So I don't know why theologians have a problem with this, especially knowing that the God of Paul and the God of Maximus is the kenotic God, the Logos incarnate in various forms of the creation. And I think you mentioned this in the book. Uh, Everything is like an incarnation of the Logos. All things are like the Logos incarnate,
yes,
in a way.
exactly. Yes. As I like to say that God is not just the Alpha and the Omega, he's all the letters in between. So so those are some of the synergies, the resonances that I noticed. But then we have to come to some of the more difficulties. One of them is the apparent lack of purpose, but that's easily dealt with because what seems to us as lack of direction, to say that's necessarily purposeless is a metaphysical overextension of science. So when people like Dawkins say that evolution or imply that evolutionary is necessarily purposeless, that's not warranted by the science. Um, and so with an immanentist view of evolution, with the Logos working out all things from within as its formal and final cause, that's perfectly consistent with there being a purpose. In fact, it makes us want to perhaps revise our normal man-made ideas of what looks purposeful. I think David Bohm in his book, what was his book called? In Implicate
Wholeness, the wholeness,
Wholeness. Yes, whole.
and the
He
intricate
drew a
order. Yeah,
diagram of
implicate order. Yeah,
a line, a line that goes in different directions haphazardly, which obviously contains more information than a simple line. Or if you take a array of random dots, takes more information to codify a random array than a lattice. So something that appears to us as being random and haphazard takes more design. If God is truly in all things down to the detail and is not just letting things run their own courses with their own agency, then God is more involved. There's more evidence of design in the random than there is in the structured. Um, so anyway, that's a separate project I'm working on at the moment, which is to try to combat the mistakes of what I think the mistakes of intelligent design movement, which try and privilege and the resurrection of the design argument based on privileging some aspects of creation and not all. Because for
yeah,
Maximus, all creation is fully theophanic and imbued by God,
yeah.
fully purposeful.
And
So that was one I quickly,
we're at a stage, I think. Sorry to interrupt you again. We are at a
yeah,
stage when, let's say, theologically minded people or faith oriented people should humble themselves to the extent that they expect scientists to do, because there's always this caveat now popping up in various narratives. Yes, it's not nature. It's the science of nature that betrays us. Nature is as is, and it's just the failure of science to grasp the nature of nature. And listening to you, I get the distinct impression that I also have and share, that you invite faith-based worldviews and theologically minded people to do the same with what they think they know about God and how God operates.
Yes, I agree. Yes. Um, so, yeah, the other main dyssynergy is, of course, the famous problem of evil, the problem of natural evil, specifically evolutionary evil. So, okay, if the Logos is the second person of the Trinity, he's therefore good with a capital G. If he's permeating all things, then how can we account for all of the pain and suffering that's a byproduct of evolution that's predated humankind for billions of years? And in my chapter on this, I'm very keen to say at the very beginning that this is a huge subject and I can't do it justice, and my views are very tentative and speculative. But I do think that a Maximian view and an Eastern Orthodox view has been neglected, has yet to come to the table. So there's lots of books published in recent years about evolutionary theodicy by various people. And if you read them carefully, there's hardly any mention of an Orthodox position or engaging with Eastern patristics. So what's different about Maximus in that regard? Well, the first thing is that I argue that we have to distinguish between an underlying evolution that's going on, which may look haphazard and disorganized, from additional accretions, additional things that may not indeed be good and may need an alternative explanation. And this is where I bring in two things. One is what seems to be Maximus's view that creation and a cosmic fall happened coextensively and at the same time. This appears two or three times in Maximus's writings where Adam fell at the same time as he was made. So if you accept that, then there's immediately no chronological disparity between all of the effects of a cosmic fall and the evolutionary records. In other words, pain and suffering has been there from the very beginning. That's number one. And number two, and this is where I go beyond Maximus slightly to draw upon Gregory of Nyssa and his idea of the garments of skin based on Genesis 3. It's an allegorical interpretation of Genesis 3 in which the garments of skin are secondary concessions or anticipations of humankind's sin, by which God provided various things um, to try and discipline humankind to return to God. So it sounds slightly originist in that it sounds like corporeality, but it's more specific than that. It's more things like sexual reproduction and various other things. I argue that, or I very tentatively suggest that evolution could be divided in between those things which are good, variation, adaptation, um, things like that, and things which are more problematic, competition, survival of the fittest, death and pain and destruction. Not that all sorts of pain are necessarily evil. A lot of it is very important adaptively to avoid damage and difficulties. So that would mean, therefore, there could have been a plan A that was that evolution of the Logoi happened to fill infinite niches without any need for competition, without any need for differential survival. So anyway, that's a very speculative idea. Um,
Yeah, not
another
necessarily.
element to that is that, sorry?
Not necessarily. I mean, well, you can present it as a speculation, but it's not necessarily remote from Maximus's own insight into reality. I mean, when he says, where's that? Is it in his chapters on knowledge, maybe? Uh, that the mystery of the cross and the resurrection are at the heart of all things. Yeah, one of the
Yes.
chapters series, either chapters on love or chapters on knowledge, one of them. And yeah, so the mystery of the cross is at the heart of all things. So is the mystery of the resurrection, which means he has this, let's call it Christ-centered sacrificial lamb kind of perception of reality, where suffering is embedded from the very beginning within the nature of the creation, which is shaped, conditioned from within by the sacrificial lamb, Christ. And in this
Yes.
setting, from this viewpoint, we realize that what you're saying with, let's say, the normality of suffering, yeah, let's put it, it's not your words, it's my word, yeah. Suffering exists, it's parts and parcel of being created, yeah. Has also a theological foundation, and again harks back to what you are talking about, or you're talking about earlier, about the dignity of all things, insofar as they bear the mark of the Logos within their own, let's call it, flesh. Yeah, so it's not so
Yes.
far-fetched.
Well, yeah. In fact, another interpretation I give in my chapter on this subject is suffering as. So, if the logoi are embedded in all things, then rather than just suffering, rather than the logos suffering for all creatures, like penal substitution view, rather than simply suffering with, which is another kind of theodicy Christopher Southgate and Ruth Page talk about. So there's an empathy, there's a walking alongside, but suffering as. So the whole of the universe is cruciform, as you say. And Holmes Rollston the third talks about this as well. Um, so the problem you would then have is to say, well, okay, well, that sounds like pantheism. How do you distinguish the logoi? So and there's an argument for that as well, based on panentheism, that the logoi are constituting all things, but they're in a finite mode of existence, and also they are not the entirety of God. God is still transcendent as well. So that's the more difficult thing. Oh, and the other aspect of Maximus is that he talks about different kinds of will. So there's the original will, and then there's a dispensatory will and a concessional will, and he gives various biblical examples of this, where the things that happened to the patriarchs, which weren't good, were part of God's dispensatory will, and the cross ultimately is part of that. So therefore, the Logos, insofar as he's a will as well as an idea, doesn't necessarily mean it's good in the normal sense of a kind of plan A. It's like a concession and anticipation. And here we get into kind of mystical theology. How on earth God can be anticipating something and putting in place plans based on that without controlling everything.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think you are sharing some stuff in common with Jordan Wood's book, The Whole Mystery of Christ.
Uh,
I noticed you quoted it. Yeah, so there are some, let's say, there's some overlap between your, let's say, Graham perception of Maximus and what we can make of Maximus's thinking when we translate it in our terms today. And there's this, let's say, mystical theology of a Christ that is no longer only the historical figure hanging from the cross, but also like an internal pattern to be found everywhere in all things, which pattern once contemplated, coming back to your other project, or the recent project at Faraday with contemplating nature and the sciences. In a contemplative approach, we realize that what we see as inconsistency flawed creation, savagery, senseless pain, pointlessness of existence, and so on and so forth. All these actually fall together when we look at them from the viewpoint of this, let's say, mystical Christ present as a pattern, perhaps, in all things.
Yes. And I think the one of the main points about Maximus is that creation is fundamentally evolutionary in that it's moving towards consummation, to its actuality. Um, I agree with Daniel Wood, Jordan Daniel Wood in that sense that true creation is to be seen by its end as well as by its beginning. But perhaps I depart from him in that I don't just think that all the in-between bits are not real, or that's what he seems to imply, that creation doesn't have a hypostasis of its own. It's only has the hypostasis in the logos. Well, that may be the final outcome, but at the moment we're not deified as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we are really real. It's not like Maximus is when he talks about the immanence of the logos, he's not referring to the end point of deification. He's not talking about the eschaton. He seems to be talking about here and now.
Yeah.
So everything is really imbued by the Logos right now. And that doesn't seem to square with what Jordan Daniel Wood is saying,
Yeah,
but that's a
true.
big
As I
subject.
said, it's just a
Yeah.
region of overlap, not an entire overlap. Because,
Yes.
as you
Yes.
said earlier, to use your metaphor, for you, it's not just the first and the last letters of the alphabet that matter. When it comes to the reality of the creation or the nature of the creation, it's all the letters in between. So I hear you. I don't want to suggest that it's just perfect harmony between your views. There are some parts where you overlap, and I think this is something also to treasure the fact that both you and Woods had this intuition of how significant, let's call it Christology, to use the technical term, can be when it comes to elaborating a mature, nuanced, contemplative doctrine of creation, isn't it?
Yep.
I don't want to take advantage of your generosity for too long. Uh,
No, it's quite, I could talk
is
for
there
ages on this.
something else you'd like to convey? Uh, the bottom line, so to speak.
Um, yeah, I think some of the take homes are that creation is essentially evolutionary to start with. So rather than thinking like Adam and Eve and a fall, it's a falling upwards. It's a maturation process, which has a very rich Eastern Orthodox tradition from Irenaeus. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is the importance of the formal cause in all things, which gets neglected by science that tends to focus on efficient causes. So I think formal causality is so underrepresented. And then the third thing is the importance of particularity. And the concept of the logoi of particulars is so important that it offers a bridge, a conduit between um, even the most egregious kinds of scientism today and Christian theology. The reason I say that is because um, no matter how much scientists might dissect and reduce, they'll always find the logos. The logos can't be divided. The logos goes down to the most detailed, particular, accidental, apparently random thing. So that really means that Christianity, theology has nothing to be afraid of when it comes to scientific reductionism, because everything is imbued by God in a not just hierarchical way, but a very entangled, interrelational way. And Maximus talks about this as well, that the logoi are defined by the logoi around them. And he talks about providence being a matter of not God just interposing from afar to stabilize everything, but everything is stabilized from within in a whole part relationship. As Tollefson says, a holomeric relationship stabilizes everything. So I think, therefore, that's something that I need to try to promote more because there's a lot of reaction against scientism, and I think Maximus's immanent view of creation can help reconcile some of those things. Also, ontotheology, the Heideggerian idea that we become idolatrous if we start to think of something in common between creation and God, and the radical orthodoxy movement's allergic reaction to anything like that, any nominalism or any any idea that there's something overarching God. I think that the logoi are bridging God and creation, but they're not a third entity. They're not something which is standing above God and creation. They are itself God. And they go down to nominal, to details in an immanent, realistic way. So this is not nominalism in the sense of labeling things as human constructs. They are, but neither is it pure participatory metaphysics where there are exemplars and things weakly echo or reflect. There is a kind of one-to-one correspondence between what God wants and what he gets. And that is very different from mere participation. It's more of a univocity, which is an anathema to talk about univocity to some of these theological groups, right? Because everything, if you're a Thomist, everything is analogy
Yeah.
and participation. Univocity seems to be the rot that set in with William of Ockham and Duns Scotus and led to scientism. But Maximus challenges that because there is univocity. In fact, he says in one passage that if if things didn't turn out the way God had intended, then God wouldn't be the God that we know he is. So there is no declension or diminution going from God into creation. There is an exact correspondence between what he wants and what he gets. So anyway,
Hence,
that's just
hence the room you make for teleology, isn't it? In your discourse.
yes,
Yeah.
it's a big subject. It's difficult to for listeners who may not be aware of all this background to see what I'm talking about. But read the book and maybe things might become a bit clearer.
Indeed, read the book. Here's the book. Uh, Amazing. I look forward to get to the to its end and start the arduous uh, process of reviewing it for some journal. Perhaps the journal for which we are both toiling. Yeah, the AIOCS journal. I have forgot to mention this. Andrew is of great help as a member of the editorial board, the advisory board of the AIOCS journal, Christian Perspectives on Science and Theology, and it's a privilege to work with him there too. And it has been a privilege to speak to you and listen to you and learn from you, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Doru.
Bye.